In 1970, the U.S. invaded Cambodia. Apollo 13 returned safely to Earth, 18-year-olds got the right to vote, and Frank Collin formed the National Socialist Party of America. The latter, seemingly insignificant, would lead to one of the greatest First Amendment battles in history. By 1976, their ragtag group could often be found at their headquarters near Marquette Park on the south side of Chicago. They marched there occasionally, protesting the integration of previously all-white neighborhoods. But in 1977, the city of Chicago passed an ordinance requiring the NSBA to post a $300,000 bond to continue their marches. With Marquette Park now out, they began to look elsewhere. Frank Collin sent a letter to each of the northern suburbs surrounding Chicago requesting permission to march. All but one ignored him. The village of Skokie had to respond. Their demographic makeup demanded it. Skokie had the highest concentration of Holocaust survivors outside of Israel, and a large population of World War II veterans. Some suggested ignoring the request, others suggested granting the request and ignoring the march. But the village couldn't. They would take a stand. Their stand would not be easy. The First Amendment to the Constitution makes it very clear. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and petition the government for a redress of grievances. Village Council Harvey Schwartz, recognizing the difficulty of fighting a First Amendment case, believed it better to let the Nazis march and get it over with. The mayor at the time, Al Smith, wanted the fight. Current mayor of Skokie, George Van Dusen, remembers the discussion.
Harvey's attitude, being a lawyer, was, let's give them the permission, do it, get it over with, move on. And it was Smith, the Irish Catholic, who said, no, not in my town, I'm not letting it happen.
The reaction from the Holocaust survivors was overwhelming. They were not about to let the Nazis march in their town. Their reminders were everywhere, from the indelible memories of the Holocaust to the numbers tattooed on their arms. They would never silently ignore the Nazis again. Survivor Agnes Schwartz, who lived in Skokie at the time, shares her memories.
That my scars are not physical, my scars are emotional. And I've had them with me all my life, and I will never get rid of it. A swastika scares me even today. I still dream about Nazi marching. I can hear the cadence of their march.
Phyllis Dad, director of the Jewish Community Center in Skokie at the time, agrees.
I and my organization were involved in trying to get them to fight this. We had too many people who were being hurt by this.
With no money to take on the village in court, Frank Collin approached the American Civil Liberties Union, and they agreed to take his case. They viewed Collin as despicable, but it wasn't about him. The ACLU would make their stand for the First Amendment. Lead attorney David Goldberger explains.
When it came across my desk, it was just classic free speech issue, and that's what the ACLU did and does today.
Martin Reddish, professor of law at Northwestern University, agrees.
Your client isn't those disgusting people. Your client is constitutional democracy. Your client is the First Amendment. They didn't like what they had to do, but they knew they had to do it.
But even the opposition respected Skokie's stand. David Hamlin, director of the ACLU in Illinois at the time, explains.
I think the leaders in the village of Skokie were representing a significant portion of their constituency. That's what they were elected and or appointed to do. So it's very hard to fault them.
The ACLU was never really concerned about losing the case on legal grounds. First Amendment precedent had been well established.
The one thing the Supreme Court, has made clear is absolutely prohibited is government-based viewpoint regulation.
But they were concerned about losing the case to public opinion, and that opinion focused on the Holocaust survivors. Phyllis Dad explains.
As they began to tell you what they had experienced, the people they had lost, the way that had happened.
But the First Amendment was never meant to be interpreted through emotion.
the fact that people watching them march would be deeply offended by them can't be a basis to justify suppression.
But would that be enough?
Firmly of the view that it was an easy case. I was on the merits. However, I was worried that it was so unpopular that the courts might do something nutty and really mess up amendment protections for all of us.
In the end, albeit reluctantly, the courts found for the Nazis. The Illinois Supreme Court upheld the right of the NSBA to march in Skokie, a decision that pleased constitutional scholars.
It applied well-accepted principles in very trying circumstances. I thought that was one of the First Amendment's finest hours.
Even many of those who fought so hard against it understood.
As an American citizen, I understood it. That if you would stop one group's right to free speech, it was the first step towards losing everybody's right to free speech.
But the decision did not please everyone. Many in the village were unwilling to accept the court's decision and were determined to stop the march at any cost. Skokie resident Sidney Stein was a teenager at the time and remembers the conversations with his friends.
If the Nazis come down here, we're gonna get eggs and baseball bats and sticks and do whatever we need to do.
Others wouldn't stop there.
I think that the people may have started throwing rocks or even come out with guns because the wounds were still just too fresh from the Holocaust.
That may have been when Frank Collin began to realize he had gotten as much from the case as he could. David Goldberger helps explain.
I kept warning the client that there was a terrific risk, physical risk, of the leader in his organization going to Skokie. I got a call from the Justice Department that they were mediators and they would like to sit down with both sides and see if some kind of a compromise couldn't be worked out to avoid the risk of a violent demonstration.
That compromise involved a return to the group's origin in Marquette Park. The city of Chicago, fresh off their own loss in court, agreed and let the NSBA return. Frank Collin wisely accepted. The Nazis never marched in Skokie, but they certainly had an effect. Prior to this case, Holocaust survivors rarely spoke of their experiences. Frank Collin changed that in a way he probably never expected.
Probably the biggest change was the people who had suffered through the Holocaust began to talk about it and share its history with the younger generations.
Jadzia Strakowska, a survivor of Bergen-Belsen and a Skokie resident at the time, said it best. Before that, we didn't talk. People did not want to listen. They told us to forget about it, to start a new life, to live here for today, not for yesterday. It's not a question of forgetting. We never, ever forgot. Holocaust education is now mandatory in the state of Illinois, and the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center, which hosts visitors from all over the world, was built in Skokie. No matter which side of the case one stood, victory can be claimed.
The Skokie case was a perfect example of unpopular speech before an audience which was certain to be offended by it. It's hard to imagine a more dramatic example of it, and the fact that the First Amendment prevailed in this case is probably still guiding city attorneys and legal counsel to municipalities throughout the country. It's an honor for me to have been involved in a case which so dramatically protected the First Amendment.
Although the First Amendment was clearly defined by the NSBA versus the Village of Skokie, the fight goes on. College campuses are currently the most visible battleground in this fight. Disagreeable speakers are often shouted down or face physical threats, and safe spaces have been created to shield some from opinions they deem as hate speech. All of this results in the question, where is the line between disagreement and hate, and who gets to decide?